Elsa Peretti did not just die, she finally stopped fighting. For 80 years, her life was a war waged on two fronts, against the crushing expectations of her father, an Italian oil tycoon who saw her as a failure, and against the fashion industry that saw her merely as a muse. She was the Halstonette who refused to be a prop, the model who threw plates into fireplaces rather than serve a man who disrespected her. She was the wild, feral glitch in the matrix of polite society. She proved that a woman didn't need to marry a dynasty, she could build one from scratch. But looking back at her legacy now, beneath the shine of the millions of open hearts sold around the world, lies a tragedy of Grecian proportions. This is the story of a woman who fled a golden cage in Rome, only to build a silver one in New York. It is the autopsy of a rebel who spent her life trying to scream loud enough for her dead father to hear her, channeling her rage into objects of such terrifying beauty that they silence the world. She was the anti-Swan, the dark angel of Studio 54, who learned too late that you can divorce a husband, but you can never divorce your own blood. Elsa was born on May 1st, 1940 in Florence, Italy, a city that is less a place to live and more a museum of impossible perfection. But the context of her birth was not art. It was war and oil. She was the youngest daughter of Ferdinando Peretti, a name that in post-war Italy was spoken with a mixture of reverence and fear. Ferdinando was the founder of API, a massive energy conglomerate. He was a titan of industry, a man of iron discipline, conservative values, and unimaginable wealth. To Ferdinando, life was a balance sheet. Everything had a place, a purpose, and a value. The Peretti household was a place of suffocating privilege. It was a world of stiff nannies and starched aprons, private tutors who spoke in whispers, and dinners where silence was the main course. In this ecosystem of rigid bourgeois perfection, Elsa was a glitch. She was not the son her father craved to inherit the empire, nor was she the compliant, decorative daughter he expected to marry a duke. She was born with a defect that no amount of lira could fix. She had a wild, feral spirit. Physically, she was an anomaly. As a child and teenager, she was not pretty in the soft, curvaceous way that 1950s Italy demanded. She was tall, gangly, and possessed a face that was architectural rather than sweet. She had a strong nose, sharp cheekbones, and eyes that seemed to look right through the polite fictions of her class. She looked like a Modigliani painting that had walked off the canvas and was angry about it. Her father made no secret of his disappointment. He was a man who valued order, and Elsa was chaos. The relationship between them was the defining wound of her life. It was a war of attrition. He tried to break her spirit with coldness. She tried to win his attention with rebellion. The incident that marked the beginning of her true life and her exile happened when she was 21. The pressure to marry, to settle down, to become a signora of good standing had become unbearable. Her father had mapped out her life, a suitable husband, a villa, children, and silence. Elsa looked at that map and set it on fire. In an act of supreme defiance that shocked Roman society, she ran away. She didn't just leave home, she abdicated her throne. She fled the golden cage of the API empire to Gstaad, Switzerland. It was a calculated insult to her father's values. The daughter of an oil tycoon was not supposed to work. She was certainly not supposed to work as a ski instructor, wiping the snow off the boots of tourists, living in a cramped dormitory, and surviving on meager wages. But for Elsa, the biting cold of the Swiss Alps was the first warmth she had ever felt. It was the warmth of autonomy. For the first time, the money in her pocket was hers. It wasn't an allowance, it was a wage. Ferdinando's reaction was nuclear. He cut her off completely. He told her, in no uncertain terms, that if she chose this life, she was dead to him. He expected her to fail. He expected the spoiled princess to crawl back to Rome when the reality of poverty set in. But he had underestimated his own genetic contribution. Elsa had inherited his stubbornness. She did not crawl back. She drifted, yes, but she drifted forward. After the snow of Switzerland, she moved to Milan to study interior design. She worked for the architect Dado Torrigiani, trying to fit herself into the box of a career woman, but the static world of furniture and blueprints bored her. She wanted movement. She wanted visceral experience. In the mid-1960s, she moved to Barcelona, a city that was vibrating with a strange, dark energy under the waning years of the Franco regime. It was here, amidst the surreal architecture of Gaudí and the salty air of the Mediterranean, that she found her first tribe. She fell in with the Gauche Divine, a group of artists, intellectuals, and radicals who used hedonism as a form of political resistance. For the first time, Elsa's strange, severe beauty was not a liability. It was an asset. She began to model. She wasn't a mannequin. She was a sculpture in motion. The photographers loved her because she didn't smile. She glared. She projected a raw masculine intensity that was miles away from the smiling, vapid models of the commercial world. She was posing for Salvador Dalí, arguing politics in smoky cafes, and learning that her body could be an instrument of art. But Europe felt too small. It was too heavy with history, too weighed down by the ghosts of the war and the judgments of her father. She needed a canvas as empty and as large as her own ambition. And in 1968, the year the world seemed to catch fire, Elsa Peretti made the decision that would change the history of fashion. She packed her meager belongings. She nursed a black eye, a parting gift from a lover she had just left in a violent quarrel, and she boarded a plane to New York City. She arrived in Manhattan with nothing. She was 28 years old, an age when most women of her class were already settling into their second decade of marriage. She had no money, no plan, and a bruise on her face that she covered with dark glasses. But she had entered the center of the universe at the precise moment it was ready for her. New York in 1968 was a city on the brink. The summer of love was rotting into something harder, faster, and more dangerous. The old guard of high society, the world of Truman Capote's black and white ball, was being circled by a new, hungry breed of celebrity. The walls were coming down, and walking through the rubble was a tall, chain-smoking Italian woman with short hair and a look of utter disdain for convention. She moved into a terrifyingly small apartment in the Tudor City complex. It was a far cry from the palazzos of Rome. It was grim, noisy, and vibrant. She started modeling to pay the rent, navigating the brutal, competitive streets of the garment district. But Elsa was not just another girl from the agency. She had a presence that stopped traffic. It wasn't long before she caught the eye of the designer Charles James, the old master of couture, who saw in her the elegance of a bygone era. But Charles James was the past. Elsa needed the future, and the future had a name, Roy Halston Frowick. The meeting between Elsa Peretti and Holston is the big bang moment of American fashion in the 1970s. Holston was the rising star, the milliner turned designer who was stripping away the structures of the 1950s to create clothes that moved with the body. When he met Elsa, he didn't just see a model. He saw his avatar. They were the original odd couple of the disco age. Halston, the boy from Iowa who had reinvented himself with a fake aristocratic accent and a trench coat, and Elsa, the real aristocrat who wanted to live like a gypsy. They bonded instantly over their shared traumas, his hidden homosexuality and deep-seated insecurity, her father's rejection, and her desperate need for validation. They became inseparable. They finished each other's sentences. They developed a shorthand of glances and gestures. Holston transformed her. He put her in his bias-cut silk caftans, his cashmere bodysuits. And in return, she grounded him. She gave his clothes a soul. She had become the figurehead of Halston's world. But she was never just a hanger. She was the vibe. When Elsa walked down a runway, she didn't prance. She stalked. She had a signature walk. Shoulders back, hips forward, a cigarette often dangling from her fingers, that signaled a new kind of woman. This wasn't a woman dressing for a man. This was a woman dressing for herself, for the night, for the movement. It was at Halston's urging that the alchemy began. Elsa had always been tactile. She experienced the world through her hands. In Barcelona, she had picked up pebbles on the beach, smoothing them with her thumb, obsessed with their shape. Now, in the electric atmosphere of New York, she began to translate those shapes into metal. She started tinkering with jewelry, not because she wanted to build a business, but because she hated what was available. The jewelry of the late 60s and early 70s was status jewelry. It was heavy, jagged, and encrusted with gems. It was designed to shout, "My husband is rich." Elsa found it vulgar. She wanted jewelry that whispered. She wanted pieces that felt like a second skin, objects that had the organic, fluid logic of nature. Her first designs were humble, almost primitive. She found a bud vase at a flea market, a simple bulbous shape. She took it to a silversmith in Spain and asked him to make it in sterling silver, small enough to wear around the neck. The result was the bottle pendant. It was a revelation. It was a piece of jewelry that was also a container. It was functional sculpture. You could put a single gardenia in it. Or, as the rumors that swirled around the Studio 54 crowd suggested, you could put a little water in it to keep your poppers fresh, or a tiny spoon for cocaine. It was innocent and decadent all at once. Holston saw the bottle and knew it was genius. He put it on his models, and suddenly every woman in New York wanted one. It was the anti-diamond. It was cool, tactile, and modern. Encouraged by Halston, Elsa began to explore further. She went back to the anatomy of the human body. She looked at bones. To most people, bones are symbols of death. To Elsa, they were the architecture of life. She was fascinated by the curve of the wrist bone, the way the ulna protrudes slightly. She wanted to celebrate that bump, not hide it. She designed the bone cuff, a wide, undulating bracelet specifically shaped to encase the wrist bone for either the left or right hand. It was armor. It was Wonder Woman meets high art. When you put it on, you felt stronger. But despite this bubbling creativity, Elsa was still living in the shadow of financial precarity. She was a personality, a muse, but she wasn't rich. She was still the disowned daughter living on her modeling fees. The contrast between her nights, spent drinking champagne with Liza Minnelli and Andy Warhol, and her days, haggling with silversmiths and worrying about rent, was growing starker. She was famous, but she wasn't safe. And always in the back of her mind was the voice of Ferdinando. "You are nothing without me." Every success she had felt provisional, like a trick of the light. She was desperate to prove him wrong, to build something that had the weight and permanence of his oil rigs, but made of beauty instead of crude. In 1974, the door to immortality opened. Holston, who was at the peak of his powers, arranged a meeting that would change the trajectory of luxury retail forever. He set up an appointment for Elsa with Walter Hoving, the legendary, terrifying chairman of Tiffany Co. Tiffany's in 1974 was a cathedral of conservatism. It was the place where grandmothers bought silver spoons and bankers bought engagement rings. It was stuffy, intimidating, and frankly, a little boring. It was not a place for cool people. It certainly wasn't a place for silver jewelry, which Hoving viewed as downstairs metal, fit for cutlery and trays, not for adorning the neck of a lady. The meeting is part of fashion folklore. Elsa arrived nervous, chain-smoking, wearing a Halston dress and carrying a wicker basket filled with her samples. She dumped them onto Hoving's mahogany desk. There were no diamonds, no rubies, just silver, smooth, sculptural, gleaming silver. Hoving picked up the bone cuff. He felt the weight of it. He ran his thumb over the curve. He picked up the bottle. He looked at this wild Italian woman with the short hair and the intense eyes. And Walter Hoving, the old guard capitalist, recognized a new currency when he saw it. He saw that the world was changing, and Elsa Peretti was the wave that was coming. He offered her a contract on the spot. It was a gamble that would save Tiffany's. But for Elsa, it was something more profound. It was the moment she finally stepped out of the role of muse, the passive inspiration for a man's genius, and became the maker. She was no longer just a Halstonette. She was Peretti. She had her own name on the door. But as the ink dried on the contract and the machinery of Tiffany's began to churn out her designs by the thousands, Elsa was about to discover that success is a far more dangerous drug than failure. She had climbed the mountain, but the air up there was thin and the view was terrifying. The Studio 54 years were about to begin, and the Queen of Silver was about to be tested by fire. But contracts signed in boardrooms rarely predict the chaos of the streets. As Elsa stepped out of Walter Hoving's office, clutching the paper that validated her existence, she wasn't just walking into a job, she was walking into a cultural windstorm. The quiet satisfaction of the artist was about to be drowned out by the deafening roar of celebrity. The era of the Halstonette was ending, and the era of the icon was beginning. But as the ink dried and the silver began to flow, Elsa would soon discover that in the high-stakes casino of 1970s New York, the house always wins, and the price of admission is often your own soul. The morning the 1974 Tiffany Company Blue Book catalog arrived in the mailboxes of America's elite, a quiet revolution began on the breakfast tables of the Upper East Side. For generations, the Blue Book had been a menu of aristocracy, a parade of tiaras, heavy diamond chokers, and emerald brooches designed for dowagers. But on page 4 of the 1974 edition, there was something that looked like a mistake. It was a silver chain, barely visible, punctuated by tiny solitary diamonds that floated against the skin like drops of light. It didn't cost a king's ransom. It cost what a working woman might save in a few months. It was called Diamonds by the Yard. Elsa Peretti had done the unthinkable. She had taken the diamond, the ultimate symbol of patriarchal ownership and rigid status, and she had set it free. She stripped away the heavy platinum claws and the intricate settings. She treated the most precious stone on earth with a casual irreverence, spacing them out on a chain so they could be worn with a t-shirt or wrapped twice around the neck for a gala. It was democratic, it was modern, and it sold out instantly. In the weeks that followed, the queue at Tiffany's Fifth Avenue flagship snaked around the block. But these weren't the usual customers. These were younger women, working women, women who were buying jewelry for themselves, not waiting for a husband to bestow it upon them. Elsa had tapped into the zeitgeist of the 1970s, the era of Ms. Magazine and the Equal Rights Amendment, and given it a uniform. She had turned Tiffany's from a mausoleum into a discotheque. But if the days belonged to the disciplined rigor of design, the nights belonged to the chaos of the era. By 1975, Elsa Peretti was no longer just a designer. She was a celebrity. And the stage for her celebrity was a converted television studio on West 54th Street that would become synonymous with the decadence of the decade, Studio 54. To understand Elsa's life in this period, one must understand the peculiar hermetic ecosystem of Halston's court. Holston was no longer just a fashion designer. He was the emperor of New York nightlife, and Elsa was his empress. They moved through the city in a phalanx of glamour, Holston in his black turtleneck and sunglasses, Elsa in her aviators and silk, flanked by Liza Minnelli and Andy Warhol. They were the beautiful people whom the rest of the world watched with a mixture of envy and voyeuristic hunger. The photographs from this era are etched into the cultural consciousness. There is the famous image of Elsa at a Halloween party, wearing a variation of a Playboy bunny costume designed by Holston, black, sleek, and dangerous, leaning over the balcony of Studio 54, a cigarette in one hand, looking down at the dancing masses like a bored deity. It is an image of supreme power. But looking closer at those photos now, with the benefit of the autopsy of history, one sees the exhaustion. The eyes are often hidden behind dark glasses, not just for style, but to hide the dilated pupils and the dark circles of a woman who hadn't slept in 3 days. The fuel for this lifestyle was cocaine. It was the white noise of the 1970s. In the circle of Halston and Peretti, cocaine was not a party favor. It was a utility. It was the coffee that started the day, the fuel that kept the design meetings going, and the energy that powered the nights that didn't end until dawn. For Elsa, a woman prone to melancholy and plagued by deep-seated insecurity, the drug offered a temporary, glittering confidence. It silenced the voice of her father in her head. It made her feel invincible, but biology has a way of collecting its debts. The physical toll was immense, but the psychological toll was worse. Elsa was trapped in the role of the muse. To the public, a muse is a romantic figure, an inspiration. In reality, a muse is often a vampire's victim. Holston fed on her energy. He used her aesthetic to refine his own. He needed her validation constantly. The relationship, once a bond of brotherly love, began to curdle into a toxic codependency. Holston became possessive. He resented her success at Tiffany's, even though he had orchestrated it. He made snide comments about her little silver trinkets while taking credit for her style. And amidst this swirling, drug-fueled vertigo, the ghost of Rome returned to claim its due. In 1977, Ferdinando Peretti died. The news reached Elsa in New York, cutting through the noise of the disco beat like a funeral bell. Her father, the titan of oil, the man whose approval she had spent 37 years running toward and running away from, was gone. He died without ever truly reconciling with her. He died without ever saying, "I am proud of you." The reading of the will was a final, complicated twist of the knife. Ferdinando, acknowledging the reality of her success, or perhaps simply adhering to dynastic duty, left Elsa a significant portion of his fortune. Overnight, the woman who had once wiped snow off skis for pocket money became an heiress of immense wealth, but it felt like blood money. It was a fortune delivered in silence. She had wanted his love. She got his shares. The inheritance triggered a profound identity crisis. Was she Elsa Peretti, the self-made designer, or was she still just the daughter of API Oil? The grief was a heavy, unresolved stone in her chest, a stone she couldn't polish into something beautiful. It was in this period of grief and internal chaos that Elsa created some of her most iconic and psychologically revealing work. She designed the bean. It seems simple, a smooth, kidney-shaped piece of silver, but the bean is a seed. It is the beginning of life. closed in on itself, protecting its potential. She designed the open heart, a heart that is not closed, but fluid, with a negative space in the center. Millions of women would wear it as a symbol of love, but for Elsa, the open part was the hole. It was the space where the love should be. She famously said, "I wanted to make a heart that was open so it could be filled." It was a cry for help, cast in sterling silver. She also turned to darker inspirations. She began to design snakes and scorpions. The scorpion necklace was a masterpiece of articulation, a silver arachnid that lay across the collarbone, its tail poised to strike. It was dangerous jewelry. It was a talisman of protection. Elsa, feeling increasingly vulnerable in the Shark Tank of New York, was arming herself. She was wearing her defenses on her skin. The tension between Elsa and Halston finally reached its boiling point in 1978. The scene of the rupture was Halston's famous townhouse on East 63rd Street, a temple of minimalism with charcoal carpets and orchids. Holston decided to throw a dinner party to celebrate Elsa. It was meant to be a peace offering, a night of reconciliation. Elsa, reverting to her Italian roots, decided to cook. She spent the entire day in the kitchen, preparing a traditional, labor-intensive Italian feast. She wanted to nurture him. She wanted to bring something real, something warm and homemade into his artificial world of takeout caviar and vodka. As the guests arrived, the usual retinue of sycophants and stars, Halston descended the stairs. He was high. He was in a foul mood. He walked into the dining room, looked at the table laden with the food Elsa had spent hours preparing, and sneered. "What is this peasant food?" he asked, his voice dripping with the cruelty of a man who knows exactly where to strike. "Why does it smell like garlic in here?" The room went silent. Elsa stood there, wiping her hands on her apron, the queen of Tiffany's reduced to the scolded daughter. Something in her snapped. It was the echo of her father. It was the years of being treated as a prop. It was the realization that no matter what she did, no matter how much silver she sold, or how beautiful she made the world, she would always be the disappointment. She didn't scream. She picked up the main course, a heavy platter of pasta, and walked to the fireplace. Halston watched, confused. Elsa looked him in the eye and hurled the platter into the fire. The food sizzled and burned. Then she reached for a sable coat, a gift from Halston, that was draped over a chair. She threw that into the fire, too. "You want to burn me?" she reportedly said, her voice low and terrifying. "Then let it all burn." She walked out of the townhouse into the cool night air of Manhattan, leaving the smell of burning fur and garlic behind her. She didn't know it yet, but she had just resigned from the position of muse. The aftermath of the fireplace incident was a slow, painful extraction. Elsa realized she was dying, not physically perhaps, though the cocaine was doing its work, but spiritually. New York, once her playground, had become her cage. The Studio 54 crowd, with their frozen smiles and endless hunger for novelty, looked like ghouls to her now. She saw the fate of those who stayed too long at the party, the overdoses, the breakdowns, the slow fade into irrelevance. She did not want to be a tragedy. She needed a sanctuary. She remembered the ruin in Spain. Years earlier, on a whim, she had bought a collection of dilapidated buildings in the medieval village of Sant Martí Vell in Catalonia. It was a ghost town. The roofs had caved in. The walls were crumbling. It was a place of dust and scorpions. But Elsa saw the bones. She saw the potential for a fortress. In the early 1980s, as the disco era crashed into the AIDS crisis and the mood of the world shifted from hedonism to fear, Elsa Peretti began her retreat. She started spending more and more time in Spain. She channeled her inheritance and her Tiffany royalties into the restoration of the village. This was not a renovation, it was a resurrection. She hired local artisans, masons, carpenters, electricians. She wanted to build something that would last longer than a season, longer than a dress, longer than a reputation. She began to construct her own world, stone by stone. She imported her favorite books, her art, her dogs. She created a studio where the light was perfect. She stopped dyeing her hair, letting the gray come in, a radical act for a woman in the beauty industry. She stopped wearing the Halston gowns and started wearing denim and linen. But the transition was agonizing. She was an addict, detoxing from fame. She missed the adrenaline. She missed the applause. There were nights in the empty, silent village where the loneliness was so acute it felt like a physical blow. She would pace the stone floors, the alchemist of loneliness, wondering if she had made a mistake. Had she exiled herself to a tomb? Yet slowly, the silence began to heal her. The shapes she found in the Spanish countryside, the twist of an olive branch, the texture of a rock, the weave of a basket, began to find their way into her sketchbook. She was no longer designing for Holston's approval. She was designing for herself. However, the world was not done with Elsa Peretti. Tiffany Company realized that their golden goose had flown the coop. They needed her. The 1980s were the era of the power woman, and Elsa's bold sculptural jewelry was more relevant than ever. They sent emissaries to Spain. They offered her new contracts, more money, more control. Elsa faced a choice. She could fade into obscurity, a hermit in a Spanish tower, or she could engage with the world on her own terms. She chose the latter. She would sell her silver, but she would never sell her soul again. She would remain in Saint Martivelle, sending her designs to New York like messages in a bottle. As the 20th century wound down, Elsa Peretti solidified her position as the absentee landlord of luxury. But the ghosts of the past were never far away. Halston's decline was rapid and heartbreaking. In 1990, he died of AIDS-related complications in San Francisco, far from the glamour of New York. Elsa mourned him, but from a distance. She knew that if she had stayed, she might have died with him. She was the survivor. But survival is a lonely business. The final chapter of her life was about to begin, a chapter defined by a frantic attempt to use her father's money to save the world, and a quiet, desperate attempt to find peace in a house full of beautiful, silent things. The smoke from that fireplace hung heavy in the air, choking the last gasp of the partnership that had defined a decade. Elsa didn't just walk out of a townhouse. She walked out of an entire way of life. The disco beat that had been the soundtrack to her rise now sounded like a frantic, empty noise. She knew that to stay was to die, if not of an overdose, then of a slow spiritual strangulation. So she turned her back on the neon and the nylon, seeking a place where the only things that glittered were the stars overhead. The flight to Spain was not a vacation. It was a defecting soldier running for the border, trading the battlefield of fashion for a kingdom of dust. If New York City in the 1970s was a cocktail of adrenaline and neon, Saint Martivelle in the 1980s was a detox of dust and silence. When Elsa Peretti fled the burning bridges of Manhattan, she did not retreat to a manicured villa on the French Riviera or a penthouse in Milan. She went to a ruin. Saint Martivelle was a medieval hamlet in Catalonia that time had forgotten. The roofs had collapsed under the weight of centuries. The streets were choked with weeds. The only inhabitants were scorpions and the wind. It was a place that mirrored Elsa's internal landscape, broken, abandoned, but possessing a terrifyingly beautiful bone structure. The restoration of Saint Martivelle became the great work of her middle age. It was an act of penance and an act of godlike creation. She poured the millions she had earned from Tiffany's and the millions she had inherited from her father into the soil. She didn't just fix a house, she rebuilt an entire village. She hired armies of local masons, carpenters, and electricians. She became the general of this small, stony army. She was exacting, demanding that walls be rebuilt using ancient techniques, obsessing over the shade of a tile or the curve of a doorway. This was Elsa exorcising the ghost of Halston. Holston worked in fabric, a medium that is fluid, temporary, and easily destroyed by fire. Elsa chose stone. Stone endures. Stone protects. She was building a fortress that no critic could sneer at, a home that no lover could kick her out of. In this kingdom of dust, she was the absolute monarch. There were no boardrooms, no fashion editors, no cocaine dealers, just the rhythm of the sun and the sound of the hammer. But as the village rose from the rubble, a different kind of haunting began. In 1990, the news crossed the ocean that Roy Halston Frowick was dead. He had died in a hospital in San Francisco, ravaged by AIDS-related Capote's sarcoma, a shadow of the emperor who had once ruled New York. Elsa was 50 years old. The other half of her soul was gone. The man who had discovered her, abused her, and defined her was dead. The Halstonette was now the last survivor of a shipwreck. His death cemented her resolve to stay in her fortress. New York was now a graveyard of memories. Spain was the only place where the air was clean. It was in this period of grief and reconstruction that Elsa faced the true weight of her inheritance. Her father's money, the petrol-soaked fortune of the API empire, was sitting in her bank accounts, vast and heavy. She had spent her youth running from it, trying to prove she could make her own way. Now she had succeeded. She was wealthy in her own right, but the Peretti money demanded a purpose. In 2000, she established the Nando and Elsa Peretti Foundation. The name order was crucial. Nando first. Even from the grave, Ferdinando Peretti took precedence. It was a gesture of supreme filial piety from a daughter who had been disowned. It was a conversation with a ghost. Elsa used the foundation to sanitize the legacy of the oil money. She directed the funds toward environmental conservation, wildlife protection, and humanitarian aid. She saved whales, protected the rainforests, and built schools. Psychologically, this was fascinating. The daughter of an oil tycoon was spending his profits to clean up the planet. It was an act of atonement. She was trying to buy redemption for the family name, trying to prove to the world and to her dead father that a Peretti could be a force for good, not just for profit. She threw herself into philanthropy with the same obsessive detail she applied to jewelry. She didn't just write checks, she traveled, she inspected, she argued with project managers. It gave her a purpose. It filled the empty rooms of her life with a sense of mission. But while she was saving the whales, she was becoming a ghost to the industry that had made her famous. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, Elsa Peretti became the absentee queen of Tiffany Co. She refused to play the corporate game. She rarely visited the New York office. She stopped giving interviews. She became a myth. Yet the paradox was that the less she was seen, the more she sold. Her designs had achieved the status of classics. The bean, the open heart, the teardrop. These were the bread and butter of Tiffany's balance sheet. At one point, it was estimated that Elsa Peretti's designs accounted for 10% of Tiffany's total global sales. She was a one-woman economy. This leverage came to a head in 2012. Elsa was 72 years old. Her contract with Tiffany's was up for renewal. The executives in New York, perhaps underestimating the crazy old lady in Spain, thought they could dictate terms. They forgot that Elsa was Ferdinando's daughter. She knew how to negotiate. She threatened to pull her name and her designs. She threatened to walk away. The panic at Tiffany's was palpable. Without Peretti, they would lose their soul. They capitulated. They paid her a lump sum of over $47 million plus ongoing royalties to secure her rights for another 20 years. It was a staggering victory. The model who had arrived in New York with a black eye and empty pockets had forced the most famous jewelry house in the world to its knees. But victory is lonely. The $47 million did not buy her a husband. It did not buy her children. As Elsa entered her twilight years, the fortress of Saint Martivelle began to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a beautifully decorated prison. She was surrounded by employees, assistants, and artisans who revered her, but who were on the payroll. The intimacy of equals, the kind she had shared with Holston in the early days, was gone. She compensated with dogs. She filled the village with them, Great Danes, terriers, mutts. They were her constant companions. She fed them the finest cuts of meat. She talked to them in Italian. They offered the one thing the fashion world never could, unconditional love. They didn't care about her sales figures. They didn't care about her past. They just wanted to be near her. Her appearance began to change, hardening into the iconic image of her final years. She cut her hair short and spiky. She wore round architect's glasses. She dressed in loose, comfortable clothes, often layers of linen and wool. She looked like a wise, eccentric sorceress, but behind the glasses the eyes were still sharp, still assessing the world for its flaws. She continued to design, but the output slowed. The pieces became more esoteric, more focused on craftsmanship than commercial appeal. She worked with lacquer in Japan, with mesh in Italy. She was obsessed with the hand of the object. In a digital world, she was fiercely analog. She hated computers. She sketched on paper. She carved wax models. She kept the craft alive by sheer force of will. Yet there were moments when the mask slipped. In rare interviews, when asked about her personal life, she would deflect with humor or retreat into silence. When asked about children, she would gesture to her jewelry and say, "These are my children." It was a line she had perfected, a shield against pity. But one has to wonder, walking through the silent, sun-drenched courtyards of her Spanish village, if the silver children were enough. They were cold to the touch. They didn't grow up. They didn't hug back. Elsa Peretti had achieved the ultimate capitalist dream. She had turned her name into a brand that would outlive her, but in doing so, she had calcified herself. She had become a monument before she was dead. The open heart was worn by millions of women who were loved, who were mothers, who were wives. Elsa, the creator of the symbol, remained the observer. She was the conduit for love, but not the recipient. As 2020 approached, the world began to shrink again, this time due to a global pandemic. But for Elsa, isolation was nothing new. She had been practicing for this for 30 years. She was safe in her fortress. But time, the one enemy she couldn't charm or buy off, was breaching the walls. Her body, once the lithe, androgynous instrument of the runway, was failing. She was tired. The fire that had burned down the Halston dinner party was banking down to embers. She began to put her affairs in order. She looked at the village she had rebuilt, the yellow stone glowing in the Mediterranean sun, and knew that she was just a temporary tenant. The stones would remain. She would not. The realization was not terrifying. It was clarifying. She had spent her life manipulating materials, silver, gold, lacquer, stone, but even the thickest stone walls cannot keep out the final visitor. As the sun set over the terracotta roofs of Saint Martivelle, casting long shadows across the empire Elsa had built from scratch. The silence she had cultivated began to deepen into something permanent. She had spent 40 years preparing for this ultimate solitude, refining her life just as she refined her silver, stripping away the impurities until only the essential remained. The fortress was secure, the dogs were fed, and the designs were done. All that was left was for the alchemist to lay down her tools and allow herself finally to become part of the silence she had loved so well. On the night of March 18th, 2021, the village of San Martín was quiet. This was not unusual. Elsa Peretti had spent 40 years ensuring that silence was the primary currency of her domain. But this silence was different. It was the heavy, final silence of a machine shutting down. In her bedroom, surrounded by the stone walls she had restored with her own money and the art she had collected with her own eye, the woman who had defined the aesthetic of the American century closed her eyes. She died in her sleep. There was no final scene of operatic drama, no throwing of plates into fireplaces, no flashbulbs. The disco queen, the wild child, the Holstonette simply drifted away, leaving behind a world that was infinitely shinier and perhaps a little colder for her existence. When the news broke the next morning, the reaction of the fashion world was a performative outpouring of grief. Instagram feeds were flooded with black and white photos of young Elsa, Elsa in the bunny ears, Elsa with Halston, Elsa smoking on the balcony. Tiffany Company took out full-page ads. Museums announced retrospectives. But amidst the noise of the eulogies, a profound irony emerged. The world was mourning a woman they hadn't really known for 30 years. They were mourning the icon of the 1970s, the muse. They were not mourning the 80-year-old woman who had died in a fortress in Spain, guarding her privacy like a dragon guarding gold. Elsa would have appreciated the irony. She had spent her life creating surfaces, polished silver, smooth lacquer, mesh that flowed like water, specifically to deflect scrutiny. She gave the world the bone cuff to make them feel strong, and the open heart to make them feel loved, but she kept the woman herself hidden behind the metal. Now that the kiln has gone cold, her legacy can finally be weighed. What remains of Elsa Peretti? First, there is the sheer undeniable ubiquity of her genius. It is impossible to walk down a street in New York, London, or Tokyo without seeing her ghost. Every time you see a woman wearing a simple silver pendant on a long chain, that is Elsa. Every time you see a diamond worn with jeans, that is Elsa. She did something that very few designers in history have achieved. She changed the way women relate to their own bodies. Before Peretti, jewelry was decoration. After Peretti, it was anatomy. Her bone cuff was not just a bracelet, it was a prosthetic of power. It was Wonder Woman's bracer, made real. She understood that women in the modern world felt vulnerable, and she gave them armor that was beautiful enough to pass as an accessory. But beneath the commercial triumph lies the personal tragedy that fueled it. Elsa's genius was born of a specific biting loneliness. She was an observer. She spent her childhood watching a cold father and her young adulthood watching a narcissistic best friend. She learned to read the room, to anticipate needs, to translate emotion into objects. The teardrop pendant is perhaps her most autobiographical piece. It is a tear that has been caught, frozen in silver, and made permanent. It is a symbol of sadness that has been commodified, turned into something you can buy and wear. It is the ultimate act of an artist, selling your pain to pay the rent. And what of the open heart? It is the best-selling piece of jewelry in Tiffany's history. Millions of them have been given as gifts of love. But remember Elsa's own words. She wanted it to be open, so it could be filled. The tragedy is that for Elsa, it never quite was. She filled the void with dogs, with houses, with philanthropy, but the central vacancy remained. She was the conduit for the world's romance, the high priestess of sentimental gifts, yet she died without a partner, without children, the last solitary survivor of a circle that had burned itself out decades ago. Her relationship with her father, Ferdinando, remains the unresolved chord at the end of the symphony. In the end, Elsa won the war. She became more famous than him. She took his name, Peretti, and made it synonymous not with dirty oil, but with clean, timeless beauty. She used his fortune to heal the planet he had helped pollute. It was a magnificent, slow-motion revenge, but it was a victory that surely tasted like ash. You cannot hug a legacy. You cannot have a conversation with a foundation. She spent her final years acting as the steward of his name, a dutiful daughter to a ghost, proving that even the most rebellious spirit eventually seeks the approval of its creator. So, was she happy? It is the question we always ask of women who choose ambition over convention, as if happiness is the only metric that matters. Perhaps happiness was never the goal. Perhaps the goal was sovereignty. In Saint Martivelle, Elsa Peretti achieved a state of absolute sovereignty. She owed nothing to anyone. She was not Halston's muse. She was not Ferdinando's daughter. She was not Mrs. Someone. She was Elsa. She lived in a world of her own making, surrounded by beauty she had brought into existence. She ate what she wanted, woke when she wanted, and created when she wanted. In a world that constantly tells women they must be chosen by a husband, by a boss, by the public, Elsa chose herself. She built a fortress, locked the door, and found that the air inside was exactly the way she liked it. The final image of Elsa is not the glossy photo of the disco era. It is the image of an old woman, dressed in comfortable linen, walking through the dusty streets of a Spanish village with a pack of dogs at her heels. She stops to look at a wall she has rebuilt. She runs her hand over the rough, warm stone. Her hands are gnarled now, the knuckles swollen, but they are strong. These are the hands that wrestled with silver, that threw plates into fires, that signed multi-million-dollar contracts. She looks at the stone, and then she looks at her wrist, where a silver bone cuff gleams in the Mediterranean sun. The stone is rough, the silver is smooth. The stone is ancient, the silver is modern. The stone is nature, the silver is art. And in that connection between the raw world and the refined object, Elsa Peretti exists. She was the alchemist who took the base metal of her own isolation and transmuted it into something that shines. She proved that a woman does not need to be a swan to be a legend. She can be a scorpion. She can be dangerous. She can be hard. And she can be beautiful. Elsa Peretti is dead, but the silver remains. It sits in velvet boxes on bedside tables around the world. It hangs around the necks of daughters and grandmothers. It warms against the skin of women who are walking into boardrooms and ballrooms. It is cold until it touches us. And in that moment of contact, when the metal meets the skin, the lonely girl from Rome is finally briefly held.